In the small, isolated town of Grimsfield, Thanksgiving was more than just a holiday. It was a tradition that held the community together. But one year, this cherished tradition turned into a horrifying ordeal that would haunt the town for generations. It all began when the Walden family, known for their extensive wealth and eccentric behavior, announced they would be hosting the annual Thanksgiving feast. The Waldens had always been reclusive, their sprawling estate at the edge of town shrouded in mystery. But their invitation was accepted with a mix of curiosity and excitement. As the day approached, an unsettling feeling descended upon Grimsfield. Strange occurrences started happening around town. Livestock went missing, bizarre symbols appeared carved into trees, and an unseasonable fog enveloped the landscape, refusing to lift. I remember walking to the Walden estate on that fateful day. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The estate loomed out of the mist, its Gothic architecture casting long, ominous shadows. The air was filled with the rich aroma of cooked meat and spices, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that hung over the place. The townsfolk gathered in the grand dining hall, a cavernous room adorned with antiquities and lit by flickering candles. The Waldens greeted us with unsettling smiles, their eyes gleaming with a strange fervor. Dinner was served, and it was a feast like no other. Platters of succulent meats, bowls of rich, creamy soups, and an array of exotic dishes lined the table. But as we began to eat, a sense of dread grew within me. The meat was unlike any I had tasted before, tender yet with a flavor that was unsettlingly unfamiliar. As the meal progressed, the Waldens began to change. Their polite veneer slipped, revealing something dark and twisted beneath. They spoke in strange tones, their voices echoing weirdly in the vast hall. The other guests were oblivious, lost in a trance-like state, devouring the food with an almost animalistic hunger. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as a horrible realization dawned. The meat, the source of that unfamiliar flavor, it couldn't be, but my mind recoiled from the thought. In a panic, I stood up, my chair clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to break the spell. The townspeople looked around, confusion turning to horror as they too realized the truth of what they were eating. The Walden's laughter filled the room, a sound that was both human and something else. In the flickering candlelight, their faces seemed to warp and twist, their humanity slipping away to reveal something ancient and malevolent. Chaos erupted as people rushed for the doors, only to find them locked. The Waldens, or the creatures they had become, moved among the panicked crowd, their movements unnaturally swift and graceful. I managed to escape through a window, cutting myself on the glass as I tumbled into the foggy night. Behind me, screams filled the air, mingled with that haunting, inhuman laughter. I ran without looking back, the fog swallowing the nightmarish scene behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. The next day, Grimsfield was a ghost town. Houses stood empty, the streets were deserted. The Walden estate burned to the ground, taking its secrets with it. No bodies were ever found, neither the townspeople's nor the Waldens. I left Grimsfield soon after, but the memories of that night never left me. The horror of what we had eaten, the transformation of the Waldens, and the fate of my friends and neighbors haunted my dreams. To this day, I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. For me, it's a reminder of that night when tradition turned to terror and a feast became a feeding ground for something unspeakable. The Feast of the Forgotten, as it came to be known, was a dark chapter in the history of Grimsfield, a chilling testament to the horrors that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most benign traditions.
Now the second story.
Thanksgiving was always a grand affair in the small town of Elmsfield, but none was more anticipated than the dinner hosted at the Haraway House, an ancient mansion perched on a hill overlooking the town. Owned by the enigmatic Haraway family, known for their wealth and eccentricity, the mansion was a relic of the past, its walls echoing with secrets. I was invited to the Haraways' Thanksgiving dinner that year, a rare honor extended to a select few in Elmsfield. The invitation itself was an ornate, handwritten card, which sent a shiver down my spine. There was something unsettling about the sprawling, Gothic script, but I brushed it off as mere nerves. On the evening of Thanksgiving, I arrived at Haraway House, its imposing structure looming against the twilight sky. The ancient oaks that lined the driveway swayed in the wind, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows. As I approached the grand entrance, the massive oak doors swung open, revealing the opulent interior, bathed in the warm glow of candlelight. The other guests were already gathered in the dining hall, a magnificent room adorned with tapestries and lit by a grand chandelier. The Haraways, an elderly couple with piercing eyes and enigmatic smiles, welcomed us. Their demeanor was polite, yet there was an underlying coldness that made me uneasy. Dinner was served, and it was a lavish spread. Platters of golden roasted turkey, bowls of rich stuffing, glistening cranberry sauce, and an assortment of pies. But as the meal progressed, a sense of unease began to grow within me. The food, though exquisitely prepared, had an odd taste that I couldn't quite place. It was then that Mrs. Haraway rose to make an announcement. Her voice, though frail, carried a strange power. She spoke of ancient traditions and the true meaning of Thanksgiving, her words laced with cryptic undertones. As she spoke, the candlelight flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the room darkened, the only light emanating from the fireplace. The flames seemed to dance and twist, forming ghastly shapes. A sense of dread filled the room, the air growing thick and heavy. Mrs. Haraway's voice grew stronger, her words now chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The guests around me sat frozen, their eyes glazed over as if under a spell. The Haraways' faces began to contort, their human features melting away to reveal something hideous beneath. Panic surged through me as I realized the true horror of the situation. The food, the strange taste, it was a potion, a concoction meant to bind us to their will. The Haraways weren't just eccentric, they were practitioners of dark arts, and we were their sacrificial offering. I tried to stand, to flee, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own mind. Around me, The other guests began to change, their bodies twisting and writhing in grotesque mutations. Their screams filled the air, a cacophony of terror that echoed through the halls of Haraway House. In a desperate effort, I focused all my will on breaking free from the spell. With a Herculean effort, I managed to stand, stumbling towards the door. The Haraway's eyes followed me, filled with malevolent glee, but they made no move to stop me. I burst out of the dining hall, running blindly through the dark corridors of the mansion. The walls seemed to close in on me, the portraits of long-dead Haraways watching with sinister smiles. Finally, I reached the entrance, the doors swinging open as if by some unseen force. I didn't look back as I ran down the driveway, the screams and the chants still ringing in my ears. I reached the safety of my home, but the nightmare didn't end there. The events of that evening haunted me, the images of the transformed guests, the demonic faces of the Haraways, forever etched in my memory. The Haraway house stood silent and deserted after that night, a grim reminder of the horrors that unfolded within its walls. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, a dark stain on the history of Elmsfield. As for me, I left the town, seeking to escape the shadows of that Thanksgiving dinner. But some horrors are inescapable, lingering in the corners of your mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of seemingly benign traditions.
Now the third story.
In the heart of the fog-enshrouded town of Ravenwood, there stood an ancient, decrepit manor known as the Blackwood Estate. On the outskirts of town, it loomed like a specter from a bygone era, its history shrouded in darkness and tragedy. This is where my harrowing tale unfolds, on a Thanksgiving night that would forever haunt the annals of Ravenwood. I was a journalist, intrigued by the macabre and the unexplained. When I received an anonymous tip about a bizarre Thanksgiving ritual at the Blackwood Estate, my curiosity was piqued. Armed with my camera and notepad, I set out on what I thought would be just another story. How wrong I was. As I approached the estate, the air grew colder, the fog thicker. The manor was a Gothic monstrosity, its windows like blind eyes, its doors like gaping mouths. The once grand garden was now overgrown, the statues and fountains decayed and twisted. I was greeted at the door by the current owner, Nathaniel Blackwood, a man whose pale, gaunt appearance was as unsettling as his home. His eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to look right through me. He welcomed me with a thin-lipped smile and led me into the heart of the estate. The dining hall was a cavernous room lit by flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls. A long table stood at the center, covered with a feast that was both extravagant and unnerving. The dishes were unusual, their contents obscured by an otherworldly mist. The other guests were an eclectic mix, each one odder than the last. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting around nervously. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, his presence dominating the room. As we began to eat, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The food was unlike anything I had ever tasted, rich and flavorful yet accompanied by a lingering aftertaste of decay. With each bite, a sense of unease grew within me, a feeling that something was terribly wrong. Nathaniel began to speak, his voice low and hypnotic. He told us of the Blackwood legacy, a lineage steeped in occult practices and dark rituals. The Thanksgiving feast, he revealed, was an ancient tradition, a tribute to the shadowy forces that the Blackwoods had served for generations. The guests listened, entranced, but I felt a growing horror. I realized that this was no mere dinner party, but a ritualistic gathering, and we were part of something far more sinister than a Thanksgiving celebration. Suddenly, the room darkened, the candles snuffed out by an unseen force. A bone-chilling cold swept through the hall, and I heard the rustling of unseen entities, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. In the darkness, the feast transformed. The mist cleared to reveal grotesque, unidentifiable dishes, pulsating and writhing as if alive. The guests around me changed too, their faces contorting into monstrous visages, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I realized then that the feast was a sacrifice, an offering to the eldritch beings that the Blackwoods revered. And we, the guests, were part of that offering. Panic took hold of me. I pushed away from the table and ran, stumbling through the dark corridors of the manor. Behind me, I could hear the chaos of the ritual reaching its climax, the sounds of inhuman shrieks and maniacal laughter filling the air. I burst out of the estate and into the foggy night, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. As I drove away, I looked back at the manor, its silhouette a haunting reminder of the horrors hidden within. I never returned to Ravenwood, and I never reported on what I witnessed. Some stories are too dark, too disturbing to be told. The Feast of Shadows at the Blackwood Estate remains a nightmarish memory, a chilling testament to the unseen and malevolent forces that lurk in the forgotten corners of the world.
Now the fourth story.
In the remote, mist-shrouded town of Hollifield, an annual Thanksgiving tradition was rumored to harbor a dark and terrifying secret. As an investigative journalist with a penchant for the macabre, I was drawn to these rumors. They led me to the Hollifield Manor, a place shrouded in mystery and fear, where the town's elite gathered each year for a Thanksgiving feast that was said to be unlike any other. Hollifield Manor, an imposing structure of stone and spires, stood on the outskirts of town, isolated and foreboding. Its history was rife with tales of disappearances and unexplained phenomena. As I approached the manor on that fateful Thanksgiving evening, an uneasy feeling took hold of me, a premonition of the horror that awaited. I was greeted by the manor's owner, Lord Jonathan Hollifield, a man whose gaunt appearance and piercing eyes exuded an aura of dread. His thin lips curled into a smile as he welcomed me inside. The interior of the manor was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and grand rooms, each one chilling in its opulence. The dining hall was a Gothic chamber with walls adorned with macabre art and a ceiling lost in shadow. A long table stood at its center, laden with a feast that seemed to writhe in the dim candlelight. The other guests were a collection of Hollifield's most influential residents, their faces etched with a mix of anticipation and fear. As the feast began, Lord Hollifield stood and addressed us. His voice was a low, mesmerizing timbre that echoed through the hall. He spoke of ancient traditions and the true essence of Thanksgiving, a celebration of harvest and sacrifice. His words were cryptic, laced with sinister undertones that sent shivers down my spine. The dishes served were unlike anything I had ever seen, meats that glistened unnaturally in the candlelight, vegetables that seemed to move of their own accord, and gravies that simmered with an eerie inner light. As the guests partook in the feast, a palpable change came over them. Their eyes glazed over, their movements became sluggish, as if they were falling under a trance. Lord Hollifield's eyes gleamed with a malevolent satisfaction as he watched his guests consume the meal. It was then that the true horror of the situation dawned on me. This was no ordinary feast. It was a ritual, and we were the unwitting participants. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, the candles snuffed out by an unseen force. The air grew cold, and a sense of otherworldly terror permeated the hall. In the blackness, I heard the sounds of something ancient and malevolent stirring, a presence that had been awakened by the feast. The guests began to change, their bodies contorting into grotesque, inhuman shapes. Their screams filled the room, a symphony of terror that chilled me to the bone. I realized in horror that the feast was a conduit, a means to transform the guests into beings not of this world. In a moment of desperate clarity, I fled from the dining hall, navigating the dark corridors of the manor. The sounds of the transformation echoed behind me, a relentless reminder of the nightmare unfolding. I finally emerged into the cold night air, gasping for breath. As I looked back at the manor, its windows glowed with a sinister light, and I knew that the horror within was only just beginning. I left Hollifield that night and never looked back. The story of the Thanksgiving feast at Hollifield Manor remains untold, a dark secret that I carry with me. The memory of that night haunts me, a chilling reminder of the unspeakable horrors that lurk in the shadows, waiting for their moment to emerge.
Now the fifth story.
In the quaint town of Eldridge Hollow, nestled amidst rolling hills and dense woods, something inexplicable began happening, something that defied logic and reason. This is my account of those terrifying events. It all started on a chilly autumn evening. I was walking home from work, the fallen leaves crunching underfoot. That's when I first noticed it, a feeling of unease, as if I was being watched. I shrugged it off as nerves, but as I approached my house, I saw that my front door was ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning. Stepping inside, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The air was heavy, suffused with a sense of wrongness. My books, usually neatly lined up on the shelf, were scattered on the floor. But there was no sign of a break-in. It was as if the books had simply fallen on their own. That night, I lay in bed, struggling to sleep. The house creaked and groaned, as old houses do, but each noise seemed sinister, filled with intent. In the early hours of the morning, I finally drifted off, only to be awakened by the sound of whispering. It was faint, unintelligible, and seemed to come from all around me. I searched the house, but found nothing. The next day, things escalated. I was at the local grocery store when I heard a crash. A row of cans had fallen off the shelf, seemingly on their own. The store owner, Mr. Jacobs, was as baffled as I was. We both stood there, staring at the mess, a feeling of dread settling over us. As the days passed, these strange occurrences became more frequent and more intense. Objects moved on their own, shadows flickered in the corner of my eye, and that constant whispering filled the air, day and night. The townspeople were on edge, talking of curses and hauntings. Eldridge Hollow, once a peaceful place, was now a town gripped by fear. Determined to find answers, I started researching the history of Eldridge Hollow. Buried in the archives of the local library, I found an old diary belonging to the town's founder, Elijah Eldridge. The diary contained disturbing entries about a forbidden ritual, something Elijah had discovered while exploring the woods. He wrote of an ancient entity, a being that existed in the spaces between things unseen but always present. According to the diary, Elijah had attempted to contact this entity to harness its power. But something had gone wrong. The last entry was a frantic warning, a plea to anyone who found the diary to leave the entity undisturbed. I felt a chill as I read the words. It was clear to me that the strange happenings in Eldridge Hollow were connected to this entity, to Elijah's long-ago ritual. But how to stop it? I gathered a group of townspeople, including Mr. Jacobs, and we set out to find the location described in the diary. Deep in the woods, we found a clearing with an ancient stone circle at its center. We could feel the energy pulsating from the stones, a malevolent presence that made our skin crawl. We knew what we had to do. Using the diary as a guide, we performed a counter ritual, hoping to banish the entity back to wherever it had come from. The air crackled with power as we chanted the ancient words. The ground shook, and a howling wind whipped through the clearing, drowning out our voices. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. We returned to the town in silence, unsure if we had succeeded. But as the days passed, it became clear that the strange occurrences had stopped. The whispering was gone, the shadows no longer flickered, and the air no longer felt heavy with dread. Eldridge Hollow returned to normal, but the memory of those terrifying days lingered. We had touched something ancient and unknowable, and though we had driven it back, the fear remained. We never spoke of it again, but I sometimes find myself listening for the whispering, watching for the moving shadows. The unseen may have retreated, but it is never truly gone, always waiting just beyond our perception.